Good evening. Good evening. My name is Donna Marino, Vice President of the Keese School. Please take a moment now to silence your cell phone as we prepare for this evening's presentation. Tonight's speaker is Parkview resident Phyllis McIntosh. Her talk on America's First Ladies was such a hit when she presented it at Parkview a year ago. We felt that the Keese School audience should have a chance to hear about this fascinating project. Phyllis is a former docent at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where she specialized in the American presidency and First Ladies exhibits. Professionally, she has been a freelance writer for more than 45 years. Her work has appeared in numerous national publications covering health, the environment, history, and the arts. Please welcome Phyllis McIntosh.
Good evening and welcome. March is Women's History Month, so what better time to talk about some of our First Ladies? When I was volunteering at the Museum of American History, the First Ladies exhibit was certainly one of the most popular exhibits in the museum, probably second only to the ruby slippers that Judy Garland wore in The Wizard of Oz. But beyond the beautiful gowns that everybody wants to see, there are some backstories that I think make some of our First Ladies fascinating. And I'd like to share some of those with you tonight. Now, our First Ladies are in a unique position. They're not elected, they're not hired, they don't even really have a job description. Yet they're among some of the most scrutinized and often most admired women in the country. Some of our First Ladies become role models and trendsetters, none more so than Jackie Kennedy. She was beautiful, of course. She had a wonderful sense of fashion, and she looked terrific in everything she wore. What became known as the Jackie look was so popular that most of us women were also wearing A-line dresses and those famous pillbox hats. Likewise, when Michelle Obama started wearing sleeveless dresses to show off those beautifully toned arms, it seemed that every anchor woman and weather woman on TV was suddenly going sleeveless. Now, a First Lady can also reflect the tone of the administration. The Carters were notoriously frugal and practical and down to earth, so it's no surprise that Rosalind chose to recycle when it came to inaugural gowns. For the presidential inauguration, she wore the same gown that she had worn when Jimmy was inaugurated as governor of Georgia, and she still looked beautiful. And then we had an abrupt change of tone when the Reagans came to the White House, bringing with them the Hollywood glitz and glamour. It was a time of formality, high fashion, big-name designers. Now, the traditional role for all First Ladies is that of White House hostess. She plans state dinners, manages White House decor, and often redecorates the place. Another thing many First Ladies do is purchase new china. The White House has a china room housing a collection representing many of the presidential administrations. Not every First Lady chooses new china or chooses to buy new china. I can't count the number of times museum visitors ask to see the Kennedy china, only to be disappointed to learn that there isn't any. Jackie Kennedy bought new crystal, manufactured in West Virginia, but she felt that the Truman china, used with service plates from the Eisenhower administration, were just fine. And she liked to use some pieces from the older sets as a reflection of the past. Now, most White House china is what we think of as a traditional formal design, maybe a floral pattern or with a metallic or colored rim. Usually there was maybe a presidential seal or a patriotic symbol such as the eagle in the center. But there was one notable exception, and that was the Rutherford Hayes china. Lucy Hayes, you remember her as Lemonade Lucy, because she refused to serve alcohol in the White House. Well, Lucy was about to order new china when she happened to meet an artist named Theodore Davis, and he urged her to consider highlighting the bounty of our country with some designs featuring North American plants and animals. She was convinced, and she commissioned him to create 130 distinct, very lifelike designs. And I remember this was the Victorian era when most decor was a little over the top. So his designs fit right in. So you see the rather odd-shaped plate, the curled edges on some of the serving pieces. My favorite is the little snowshoe plate that you see there on center left, and appropriately, that was an ice cream plate. Not everyone was thrilled with these designs. One Washington socialite complained that she could hardly eat her soup peacefully if she had to watch a coyote leap at her from behind a pine tree. Now, the styles of White House entertaining have changed over the years. What is believed to be the first state dinner was held in 1874 during the Grant administration. It was to honor the King of Hawaii. And Julia Grant, bless her heart, served a dinner of no fewer than 29 courses. Again, this was the Victorian era, so the dinner probably fit in with the excesses of the time. If you look at that picture, look at that terribly intricate design of the chair behind, that she's sitting on. And there's a lot going on in that dress, too. So I think she looks like somebody who might have served a 29-course dinner. I've not been able to find a menu of exactly what was served for those 29 courses, but clearly you wanted to be hungry if you went to dinner at the Grants. By contrast, state dinners today feature 4 or 5 courses. At the other end of the entertaining spectrum, Eleanor Roosevelt caught a lot of flack for hosting a picnic lunch for King George VI and Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain, at which she served them hot dogs. They might have wished they'd been around 50 years earlier and could have gone to Julia's house instead. Our first ladies approached the job with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Most relished the opportunity to put their stamp on the White House decor and entertaining, and like having a bully pulpit to express their views on matters that are important to them. One who did her best to assure that she became First Lady was Helen Taft. She really, really wanted her husband, Howard Taft, to be president. He was rather lukewarm about the idea. He really, really wanted to be on the Supreme Court. But in 1908, when Teddy Roosevelt decided not to seek another term, Helen helped persuade him to back her husband for president. William hated campaigning and reportedly complained that the campaign was the worst 4 months of his life. Imagine a 4-month presidential campaign. Sounds good to me. Helen guided him through the campaign and helped write his speeches. And when he won, Helen became the First Lady to ride in the carriage with her husband to his inauguration. She felt she deserved it. And in so doing, she set a tradition that has been followed by First Ladies since. Helen Taft created 2 other Washington traditions. She was instrumental in the planting of the cherry trees around the tidal basin, and she was the First Lady to donate her inaugural gown to the Smithsonian. As for William Howard Taft, he eventually realized his dream, too. He was later appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and served in that role for 11 years until his death. But some first ladies were not so thrilled to find themselves in the job. One was Bess Truman. Harry Truman noted that Bess was not especially interested in the pomp and formality associated with living in the White House. Her daughter, Margaret, noted that one of Bess's favorite first ladies was one of our early ones, Elizabeth Monroe, wife of James Monroe. And she admired Elizabeth because Elizabeth had been so successful at virtually disappearing from the White House for most of her husband's 2 terms. Bess was pretty good at disappearing too, usually back home to Independence, Missouri. And I have to admit, their home there does look cozier than the White House. So let's look at some of the history of our First Ladies. The title of First Lady is thought to have first been used by President Zachary Taylor at Dolly Madison's funeral in 1849. He called her the First Lady of our country. It took a while for that title to catch on, but it certainly was an improvement over some of the earlier forms of address, like Mrs. Presidentress, which didn't exactly roll off the tongue. Now, we always think of a First Lady as the wife of the president, but that has not always been the case. When a president's wife had died or was perhaps too ill to carry out her official duties, the president turned to other family members to step in. And the Smithsonian does consider some of these as official First Ladies. The first president to have another relative as First Lady was Thomas Jefferson. His wife had died 18 years before he became president, so his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, served as his First Lady. Andrew Jackson was forced to enlist other family members when tragedy struck soon after his election in 1828. His wife, Rachel, had been married before to a reportedly cruel and jealous husband. They divorced, and she married Andrew Jackson. But during the presidential campaign, it came out that the divorce had not been finalized before she remarried. She was called a bigamist and an adulteress, and it really got very nasty. Jackson won election anyway, but before he could be inaugurated, Rachel died of an apparent heart attack. It is thought that the stress of the vicious campaign aggravated existing health problems and contributed to her death. So Jackson's niece, Emily Donaldson, and later his daughter-in-law, Sarah York Jackson, served as his First Ladies. Now, we've had only one president who never married, and that was James Buchanan, our 15th president. Because he never married, it has been speculated in recent years that he might have been gay. But he had been engaged as a young man. However, his fiancée committed suicide. So make of that what you will. When he became president, he asked his niece, Harriet Lane, to serve as his First Lady. Harriet was very popular, and she was actually the first to be called First Lady while she was serving in that role. Now, while these cases of other family members taking on the duties of First Lady all occurred in the 19th century, we may well see it again when we finally elect a woman as president. Some of these First Ladies, especially other family members who served, were quite young, just in their 20s. The youngest wife of a president was Frances Cleveland. She married President Grover Cleveland when she was just 21. He was 48. They're the only presidential couple ever married in the White House. And these two have a rather interesting story. Grover Cleveland had been a law partner and close friend of Frances's father, so she had known him all her life. She knew him as Uncle Cleve. Uncle Cleve had bought her a pram when she was a baby. He doted on her during her childhood. When her father was killed in a carriage accident, Grover handled his estate and became unofficial guardian to Frances. It was thought that he might eventually marry Frances's mother. Her mother thought so too. But surprise, surprise, he was waiting for Frances. I think the tabloids and talk shows today would have a ball with that story. Frances was obviously very pretty and immensely popular. In some ways, she was the Jackie Kennedy of her day. She was mobbed by admirers and followed by the paparazzi of the day. Companies even used her image to hawk their products. To escape the hoopla, the Clevelands purchased land and built a farm just north of Washington, an area that we now know as Cleveland Park. In 1888, Grover Cleveland was not reelected. He lost to Benjamin Harrison. As the Clevelands were getting ready to leave the White House, Frances reportedly told a White House employee, "I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house and not let any of them get lost or broken, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again." That turned out to be a prophetic statement because in 1892, the Clevelands did come back after Grover Cleveland defeated Harrison. Until our most recent election, Grover Cleveland had been the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. Now, the oldest woman to become First Lady was Jill Biden, who was 69. That's not too surprising, I guess, since people are living longer. But for many years, the oldest had been Anna Harrison, the wife of our 9th president, William Henry Harrison. She was 65 when she became First Lady. But poor Anna never even made it to the White House. She was too ill to travel when her husband left for Washington, and as it turned out, his inauguration proved to be his undoing. He gave a long-winded address. He went on for over an hour on a cold, windy day. He caught a bad cold. It turned into pneumonia, and a month later, he was dead. So he has the distinction of the longest inaugural address and the shortest term in office of any of our presidents. Anna was still at home packing when she got the news. We have had 3 more First Ladies than presidents. As I mentioned, Andrew Jackson had 2. And in 2 cases, the First Lady died while her husband was president, and he remarried while still in office. The first was John Tyler, who succeeded William Henry Harrison. After his wife, Letitia Tyler, died at age 50, he soon married a much younger one, Julia, who was just 24. Now, Julia was apparently inspired by European royalty because she liked to receive guests sitting on a dais surrounded by ladies in waiting, all dressed in white. Also reflecting her love of pomp and circumstance, she insisted that "Hail to the Chief" be played whenever the president entered the room. Between the 2 wives, John Tyler fathered 15 children. As nearly as I can determine, one of his grandsons is still alive. The man is 96. And that man's brother, another grandson, died just a few years ago. Now, these are not great-grandsons. These are grandsons of our 10th president, who was born in 1790. Obviously, there were several generations of that family who produced children very late in life. Now, John Tyler's kind of an interesting guy. He's known for a few things other than fathering children. He was William Henry Harrison's vice president. He was the Tyler in Tippecanoe and Tyler II. And he became a figure of controversy after Harrison died. Today, the 25th Amendment spells out the order of presidential succession, but that wasn't passed until 1967. I find that kind of hard to believe. When William Henry Harrison died in 1841, it wasn't clear whether Tyler was the acting president or the actual president. He decided he was the president, quickly moved his family into the White House. But his enemies persisted in calling him His Accidency. He was a loyal Virginian to the end, and in later years was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, but he died before the session started. Now, the third president with two first ladies was Woodrow Wilson. Ellen Wilson died in 1914, about a year into Wilson's administration. A year later, Wilson married a widow named Edith Bowling Galt. She's the one who was famously accused of acting as president after Wilson was incapacitated by a stroke. There were references in the press to the petticoat government, and Wilson was referred to as first husband. It's true that Edith acted as a gatekeeper and determined what issues needed to be brought to the president's attention and relayed instructions to government officials. It may be a stretch to say she acted as president, although we may never know just how much power she actually wielded. Now, in addition to their official duties, some first ladies were also mothers of young children. Michelle Obama referred to herself as Mom-in-Chief. Oops. I think I did something wrong here. I think I pushed something I should not have. Does anybody know how to get that off of? Do what? Tap on the screen. Let me try backing it. Yeah, the clicker doesn't work. I'm sorry. There we go. Thank you. I'm technologically inept, as you can tell. So Michelle Obama referred to herself as Mom-in-Chief, but the one that had her hands most full was Edith Roosevelt, Teddy's wife. She had 6 children, Teddy's daughter, Alice, from a previous marriage, and 5 of her own, including 4 rambunctious boys. The family had a menagerie of pets, including several dogs, a pony, a pig, a badger, a macaw, a barn owl, and a one-legged rooster. One time when one of the boys was sick upstairs in the White House, his brothers ushered the pony onto an elevator and took it up to visit the sick boy. It must have worked because he recovered. With all this chaos, it's not surprising that Edith needed help. She was the first to institutionalize the office of First Lady, hiring a paid staff and a social secretary to manage her public image and that of her family. Now, the Roosevelts weren't the only ones to have some unusual pets, and my very favorite is Grace Coolidge's pet raccoon, Rebecca. Someone had given the Coolidges a raccoon that was intended to be served for Thanksgiving dinner. Yum. And apparently, the Coolidges didn't have much taste for raccoon, so they kept the animal as a pet and named her Rebecca. Rebecca lived quite the high life. She traveled with Grace Coolidge. For Christmas, she was given an embroidered collar inscribed with White House raccoon. She was fed shrimp and persimmons and her favorite, eggs. She loved participating in the White House Easter egg roll, maybe because that's where the eggs were. A fenced tree house was built for her in a large tree on White House grounds. And inside the White House, she roamed free and got into quite a bit of mischief. She was known to unscrew light bulbs and unpot plants. She could amuse herself for a long time in a bathtub with a little water and a cake of soap. And all this time, we thought the Coolidges were stuffy. When they left the White House, they gave Rebecca to the National Zoo. Now, I've been a docent at the National Zoo for many, many years, and whenever I read about Rebecca, I can't help but think what fun it would have been to talk to visitors about Rebecca Raccoon. For much of our history, the First Lady's duties were limited to hostess, redecorating the White House, selecting china. But since the 1960s, it has been expected that every First Lady will adopt a cause outside of the White House. And the First Lady we have to thank for that is Lady Bird Johnson. She was an activist in several ways. She courageously took a 1,600-mile trip through the South to support passage of the Civil Rights Act. Later, she took another 1,600-mile whistle-stop tour as the first First Lady to campaign alone for her husband. But she's probably most remembered for championing the cause of beautifying our cities and highways. At her insistence, the National Park Service planted more than 2 million daffodil bulbs in D.C. She was instrumental in passage of the Highway Beautification Act, which replaced those ugly billboards and junkyards along our roads with landscaping and flowers. The Johnson China reflects and honors her efforts with its designs of Texas wildflowers. So every First Lady since has adopted a cause. Pat Nixon, volunteerism. Rosalind Carter, mental health. Nancy Reagan, drug abuse. Both Barbara and Laura Bush focused on literacy. Hillary Clinton on health care. Michelle Obama, childhood obesity. Melania Trump, anti-bullying. Jill Biden focused on educational opportunity and support for military families. Now, one I did not mention in that list was Betty Ford. She was not in the White House all that long, but she had quite an impact. She was notable for championing women's causes. She lobbied hard for the Equal Rights Amendment, which her husband opposed. And perhaps she's most admired for speaking openly about her breast cancer and later her addiction to alcohol and prescription pills. Now, most First Ladies never discussed their health, and even in the 1970s, breast cancer was still somewhat of a hush-hush disease. But when Betty spoke about her diagnosis and treatment, magazines and newspapers started writing about it, and millions of women went for breast exams, no doubt saving many lives. She later became addicted to alcohol and prescription drugs after she left the White House, and again, she went public about her treatment. And in 1982, she famously founded the Betty Ford Center for Treatment of Addiction. Now, Betty was a bit of a character, too. She was a trained dancer, and she said it had always been her dream to dance on the cabinet room table. So, on her last day in the White House, she realized her dream. So, who were our most influential First Ladies? Well, I suppose it depends a lot on who you ask. But I like to point to two early in our history who I think wielded considerable influence. The first is Abigail Adams. She was the first to live in the White House. She was the wife of our second president, John Adams, and the mother of our sixth president, John Quincy Adams. Abigail had no formal education, but she was intelligent, a voracious reader, very interested in political affairs, and she readily shared her views with her husband. John was away a lot, attending the Continental Congress, serving as a diplomat in Paris, and through it all, they maintained an extensive correspondence. In 1776, when John was helping develop a code of laws for our new nation, she wrote this: "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Wow. Yeah, you go, Abigail. Despite her threats, however, it took men another 144 years to give women the vote. Another standout in early America was Dolly Madison. James Madison was a rather retiring sort, and she was the perfect counterpart. She liked wearing turbans, which gave her a rather exotic look, and she definitely was the hostess with the mostest. She hosted weekly receptions that were so popular and crowded that they were known as Dolly's Squeezes or Dolly's Crushes. Anyone with an introduction was welcome. A lot of the events encouraged conversation among political enemies, and a lot of political business got done. I think today's Congress could probably benefit from some of Dolly's squeezes. But Dolly is probably best known for her courage during the War of 1812, when the British were invading Washington and about to burn down the White House. She refused to leave until she was sure that Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington had been saved. Now, probably the most influential and most admired of all First Ladies is Eleanor Roosevelt. She certainly was in a league of her own. Of course, she was our longest-serving First Lady, and she connected with the American people in a way that most First Ladies have not. She traveled extensively throughout this country and abroad. She held press conferences, gave lectures, wrote a daily newspaper column. And after FDR's death, she continued in public service. She was appointed special delegate to the United Nations and elected to chair the UN Human Rights Commission. She helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was approved by the UN in 1948. So it's no surprise that Eleanor Roosevelt routinely tops the rankings of our First Ladies. Now, there are any number of rankings that you can find done by different organizations, but one of the most respected is conducted by Siena College in New York. And they periodically ask historians, presidential scholars, and political scientists to rank the First Ladies according to 10 criteria, which you see there at the top. Background, value to the country, White House steward, integrity, being her own woman, value to the president. They have conducted this survey 6 times since 1982, most recently in 2020. Many in the top 10, as you see there, are our more recent First Ladies, but you'll notice Abigail Adams is number 2 in all of the surveys except one. And Dolly Madison pops up there fairly frequently, too. Of course, somebody has to bring up the rear. So we have the final 5, the First Ladies that are considered to be least effective. Now, some poor rankings may be deserved. Margaret Taylor reportedly retreated upstairs, some said to the attic. Other rankings may have been affected by negative views of their husbands' administrations. Florence Harding, for instance, was an active First Lady. She championed women's rights and animal rights, but her ranking may have been affected by the rampant corruption in Warren Harding's administration, not to mention his notorious philandering. But other rankings, I think, seem a bit unfair. Letitia Tyler died while she was in the White House. Ida McKinley had epilepsy, and a number of our other First Ladies were not in the best of health. A really tragic figure is Jane Pierce, who you see down there in the bottom on several of the surveys. And she's really a very tragic figure. She had already lost 2 of her 3 children by the time Franklin Pierce was elected president. And after the election, the family was traveling, the Pierces and their remaining son were traveling by train to Washington, and the train was involved in an accident. Jane saw her remaining son, just 12 years old, die violently in front of her eyes. She never recovered and was almost never seen as First Lady. It is interesting how the rankings change with the perspective of history. One interesting case is Mary Lincoln. Initially, she was ranked last. Now she's up to 29th. As more has been written about her, she's been looked on more favorably. No doubt she was a volatile and probably mentally unstable personality, but she was in a tough position as First Lady. She was a Southerner. Her relatives were fighting for the South in the Civil War. She was criticized for decorating the White House during wartime, but the Lincolns felt it was important to show that the Union was surviving and would endure. Mary visited hospitals and wrote letters for soldiers, but she didn't claim any credit for this. And she, too, of course, was a most tragic figure. Only one of her 4 sons survived to adulthood, and she saw her husband assassinated beside her. Now, interestingly, the First Lady who has seen the steepest rise in rankings is Nancy Reagan. She was widely criticized when she was First Lady for what was seen as her extravagance during a time of recession. She was especially criticized for her purchase of a large new set of china. It consisted of more than 4,300 pieces, full settings for 220 guests. But she felt that the Johnson china, which we saw with the wildflowers and the border, was a little too informal for state dinners. There was no Nixon, Ford, or Carter china. But in fact, the new Reagan china was fully funded by outside donations and not by the taxpayers. So in 1993, Nancy Reagan ranked next to last. She now ranks 15th. She's especially highly regarded for her value to the president, which was one of the 10 criteria in which they judge our First Ladies. And she's been greatly admired for her later support for Alzheimer's research. So it will be interesting to see how assessments of our First Ladies continue to change over the years and with the perspective of history. So in conclusion, our First Ladies are not perfect, but most have managed to tailor the job to their own background and interests. Most have done their best to support their husband's presidency by acting as his advisor and confidant, carrying out social duties as the nation's hostess, and serving as a role model for the women of this country. Thank you. I will attempt to answer any questions, but I assure you I am by no means an expert on all the First Ladies, so.
What do you know about Martha Washington?
I'm sorry?
What do you know about Martha Washington?
What do I know about Martha Washington? Well, she was very skilled at managing a plantation. She was definitely a helpmaid and confidant to George Washington. She traveled. I think she was at Valley Forge, or she did travel during the war, during the Revolutionary War. So she, if I can back this up to the rankings, we see that she shows up there in 9th place in several of the surveys. So she's rather well regarded, obviously, by historians.
Did you mention Barbara Bush?
Only in passing, when I was talking about the causes that the various first ladies adopted, yeah. Were you wondering something about her, or no? She, again, shows up here as I see her in 8th place in one of the times. So, she's regarded well, too. Yeah.
If you could sit down and have tea with, if you could sit down and have tea with any of the first ladies that you've studied, which one would you choose?
Eleanor Roosevelt, without a doubt. Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah. Yes. I think for all the reasons that I cited here, I mean, she's just so, I guess, above and beyond what many of the first ladies have done, Who would be the most fun? Betty Ford, probably. I want to hear more about the dance on the cabinet room table. I think she would be a lot of fun to talk to, yeah. Yeah.
You didn't say much about the more recent first ladies. You could skip the current, but others?
Well, as you see on the rankings here, I suspect that maybe the reason our more recent first ladies show up so high in the ranking is that they were the ones that were in the news, or that the people surveyed, the experts surveyed, were more familiar with. But I mean, certainly, many of them, Jackie Kennedy was admired for her stewardship of the White House. That was one of the criteria in which they were judged. She famously gave that tour of the White House on TV. And I think certainly Rosalind Carter was very involved during Jimmy's administration in the mental health area, Hillary Clinton on health care. So I think, many of them, Lady Bird Johnson, she's one of our more recent ones, and I spoke about her and her role in highway beautification and becoming the first to get out there and campaign for her husband and campaign for passage of the Civil Rights Act, traveling through the Deep South. I mean, that was a very courageous thing to do. So, I think our first ladies will stand the test of time. Our current first ladies will stand the test of time pretty well, many of them.
If you were to give advice to the first gentleman when there's a woman president, what would you say in light of the role that the first ladies have played?
If I were to speak to him, is that what your question was? Yes. Well, it would be interesting because he will carve out a new role that, would be the first in our history. And I doubt very much that the first gentleman would be doing too much in the way of White House decor and, planning the state dinners or picking out the china. I'm sure that will fall to other friends, family members, or paid staff. I remember at the museum, when I was there, the current First Lady's inaugural gown was always in a center case, and then some of the other more recent ones were around the perimeter. And the woman who was in charge of the First Lady's exhibit said, "I can't wait to put the," how did she put it? To put the, well, not the first gentleman's suit, but she wanted to put the first woman president's official suit in that case. So I don't think they would put the first gentleman's. I kind of doubt his tux would show up in any of the exhibit. But it'll be very interesting. It will be very interesting to see when that finally happens, if any of us are around to see it. But I can't wait. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Maybe I can get two questions. And how did you get interested in this hobby of yours?
Well, I think through volunteering for a while at the Museum of American History, and just finding, learning of some of these backstories, which were a lot of fun to tell visitors, that it's more than just the gowns in China, that these were real living, breathing people with all their foibles.
In that regard, in terms of being a diplomatic component of the U.S. government, the First Ladies, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course. Any other ones in particular?
Well, certainly most of the recent ones have traveled quite a bit with their husbands, and have traveled independently.
Independently, in particular, yeah.
Yes. Among the more historical ones, I really don't know how much of that took place, but I think that has become to be expected of our First Ladies, that they will play some diplomatic role, and some of it on their own, not just with their husbands.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.